Kia ora koutou. Welcome to HR Chats with me, to Radar, the podcast, and I guess if you're watching this, vidcast, where we chat about all things HR and HR related. If you have watched or listened to any of the previous ones, you'll know that I always give a shout out to you, the listener and viewer. If there is anything you want us to talk about, if there is anyone you want us to talk to, just let us know through the HRNZ website. This is going to be a good one today. Kirsten Patterson, you probably know her as KP, Institute of Directors Chief Executive. She's a qualified lawyer, Chartered Fellow of the Human Resources Institute of New Zealand, extensive governance and leadership experience, actively involved in a number of community initiatives. Also, a strong advocate of diversity. She was one of the founding members of Global Women's Champions for Change, a group of senior executives and directors who commit to diversity in the workplace. Also a founding member of Whisper, an organisation promoting women in sport. She mentors a number of business leaders. Hello, Kirsten. How are you?
I'm great. Kia ora. How are you?
Look, I'm super good and very excited to be talking to this. Today we're talking kind of specifically about the role of directors in HR and how's that changed in a little while. I'm going to ignore the COVID elephant in the room because we've covered a lot of that, because there's also a lot of really other kind of fascinating developments. I seem to have seen a lot in the news recently when it comes to directors, kind of a lot more personal responsibility.
Yeah.
Is that a big change?
Yeah, it's been a big change. So it really started with a shift around 2015 with health and safety legislation. So at that time, that was one of the few areas where we saw much more personal liability coming back onto directors. And since that time, we're seeing a similar approach taken with other pieces of legislation. And as a result, directors are sort of looking at that risk and reward aspect and going, hey, I'm not sure that the reward for all of this risk is a fair one. You know, if I have a bad day at work, I can get fired, but hopefully go and get another job. If you're a bad day as a director, you can lose your house and go to jail. So it is a really serious role, and that's why they are really focused on the information that they're getting from management and making sure that there's really good reporting in place.
It does, gone, I suppose, are the days where these are just sort of nice to have roles, cushy sort of end of career thing. You get bunged onto a board and you earn your fees and off you go.
Yeah, absolutely. Being a director is not a part-time gig anymore. I think there was maybe this perception in the 80s that, they'd sort of roar up for a meeting once a month and have this lovely lunch in the boardroom and, used to have their own private lift and wasn't it a lovely life? But actually being a director is an active, hands-on role now because there is huge liability and workload associated with it. And we saw that during the recent crisis, just the number of board meetings, went from once a month to once a week, sometimes more. And we need people, there's no room for passengers on boards anymore. We need people who are actively engaged in their profession and actively engaged in the business and really able to apply judgment to a whole pile of unknowns, because that's what the board gets left with, right? They get left with having to make choices about investment, choices about innovation, being comfortable with risk. They have to make decisions in the unknown. All the easy stuff gets left to management.
Yeah. Look, it's probably a good question. There may be people watching this who aren't really sure what a director does. It's probably the big unknown for some people.
Yeah.
We know they're there and they issue edicts and offer guidance. What, if you were to sum it up, what would you say the role of a director actually is?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And the first time I'd been to a board meeting was when I was in one of my HR roles working at New Zealand Rugby. Before that, I'd never been to the board meeting. I saw, reporting that I used to do every month, that used to get put in these board packs and go into this sort of private room, and we never knew what happened. We'd see them kind of walking around the hallways, but you never got to see behind the door and see what kind of happened. But there's much greater transparency now. What the board does is the board is there and to steer the ship, to be looking at the horizon. So management's often down getting the ship working and sort of doing the directional pieces, but your board is up in the helicopter looking ahead out at the horizon of where the ship needs to go. So they're looking for those icebergs, they're looking for those islands that we might need to maneuver around or where we want to head ourselves towards. They can see that there's a storm coming over the horizon that maybe we just can't see because we're too close to the detail. And why we have a board to do that is because they're there to represent the shareholders and the stakeholders' voice. There's this really sort of ridiculous stat I can never remember the exact details of, but just about how many of us in New Zealand have a connection or shares in Air New Zealand, for example, whether that's through super fund or our Kiwi Savers, etc. Lots of us hold shares in Air New Zealand, but we all couldn't turn up and run in New Zealand every day, even though we own a little bit of it or feel like we do as passengers sometimes. We can't all turn up and make the decisions about what we're going to do. So as a result, we appoint a board to take care of that for us. And the reason we have a board do it and not just one person is because of diversity. We want to make sure we've got the best skill set, and you're not going to find that skill set in just one person. You're going to need a team of 6 or 8 to make sure you've got finance covered and health and safety, and who's your leadership person, who's your innovation person, who's going to be a person who understands deeply the engineering aspects of Air New Zealand. We put that team together, they're looking at the horizon, looking after all of us.
You know, diversity is a big one as well. So not only diversity amongst the workforce, but this board diversity. But we always seem to run into the issue of, do we have enough people putting themselves forward, or enough people qualified? How do we diversify the diversification of our boards?
Yeah, look, it's not an issue of pipeline. There is really great candidates available and willing to serve. But often the conversation about diversity goes pretty heavily to gender in the first instance.
Yeah.
And as you've identified, it can't just be about gender. It's got to be about diversifying our boards in their broadest sense. We need to make sure that we've got Māori and Pacifica voices being heard in our boardrooms. We need to make sure that the disabled community are represented and their voices are being heard. And we need to make sure that we've got diversity of thought and diversity of skill set. So that's a lot to try and fit into a team of 6 or 8 people. But the kind of measures that we see, as I said, often are about gender at the moment. We're starting to see more ethnicity reporting, but often the conversation is focused around our NZX boards or our state sector boards. And the reason for that is because they're publicly notifiable positions. So we can see the makeup of those boards and they're advised and transparent to the public. But there is much more diversity in our not-for-profit boards, for example. If you go to a not-for-profit conference or you look at not-for-profit boards, they're incredibly diverse. But we can't measure that at the moment because they're not all publicly known. And that shows there is great talent happening in lots of different places. We just need to bring more of that talent into the commercial sort of listed environment. And it's really important that we get people from all sorts of skill sets who put themselves forward for roles. And I really encourage everyone from HRNZ to look at how they could contribute to governance. It might be, for me, I started at my local Plunket committee and I went onto the Plunket board and got involved in governance in a community sense that way before I moved on to other things, and really encourage more in the HR community. There's not many HR specific or backgrounded directors at the moment, particularly in the leading director community, and I think there's opportunities for their great skill set for them to serve.
Absolutely. Now, hopefully, the next few minutes of conversation are not going to put people off. Because, you know, and I've been to a lot of those not-for-profit conferences. What a great showcase of everything wonderful about New Zealand they are, and the kind of representation there. But once we move into kind of, I guess, you know, the business side of things, and we've spoken a little bit about this, you know, the remuneration and the rewards, particularly now that there is more responsibility. You know, we've seen the rise of, I guess, a more litigious kind of environment where people are being held responsible for things. You know, we've had funds from Australia, litigation funds coming in for class action suits. Tell me how that landscape's changed and what people need to look out for.
Yeah, it has changed quite a lot. So as you said, a lot of litigation funders and the kind of environment has changed, and that we're seeing that play out in the D&O, director and officer insurance market. So part of it, if you're looking at going onto a board, is making sure you're doing really good due diligence of the company that you're going to go on to. And really good questions that our president, Alan Isaac, president of the Institute of Directors, he's got 2 really great questions that he always asks. Always looks at solvency, financial solvency, because you've got an obligation to make sure that's in place as part of due diligence anyway. But he goes, do I like and trust the chair of the board? And do I like and trust the CEO? And so those are two really great questions. Make sure that obviously that the organisation can pay its bills, but you're going to be putting your reputation, your brand together with the people sitting around the table with you, and you need to know that you can trust them, because you will be dealing with some tricky issues, and some stuff that again is unknown, some stuff that you're going to have to make some leaps of faith and some judgment over, and to do that you want to be working in a team with people you can trust.
Yeah. Because when it comes to, the likes of health and safety, directors are responsible, aren't they? They may never have set foot in the workplace itself, but the, responsibility, I suppose, cascades up.
Yeah, it does. And so often we see people move into governance careers after having an executive career or a CEO career, because the more you move through management levels, the more comfortable you get with that, because you lead bigger teams and you get more and more removed from the day-to-day operations. So for me as CEO, for example, in our customer call centre team here, I'm responsible for every phone call they make, every email they send, every interaction that they have with a customer, even though I can't be over or review every single one of those. Now, early on in your career, I used to want to be a micromanager and I want to check stuff and before things went out in my name. Whereas the higher up the food chain you get, you have to get much more comfortable with that. And particularly that's true for directors. Now, not only are they so removed from some of the day-to-day operations that are happening, they've then got the personal liability. So it's that ultimate trust exercise. So to do that, they need to make sure, their primary role is to appoint the CEO, and the CEO is their way of making sure they're setting the culture through the organisation. The people that they choose to put into leadership roles determine the culture. So when we say things like culture starts at the top and the board is responsible for culture, that comes through the way they choose the leadership for the organisation. And one of the big things that boards are particularly worried about right now is culture and conduct. How do they influence positively the cultural environment to make sure that it's a safe place to be? Mental health and well-being, bullying, harassment, diversity issues are being addressed. It's driving innovation, but that there's really good systems in place. And how do they get assurance over that when they're not going to be there every day?
Yeah, it sounds like a lot, in that kind of big picture thing. Have you got any kind of sort of tangible examples of people or organizations that have really made a big change in the last little while that you can point to and go, see, that there is a very good example of what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think there's some really great examples. We're lucky in New Zealand because we have our 2 degrees of separation gives us some great connections to what organisations are doing, and we get a greater level of transparency, I think. A great example we've got is in relation to Spark. So they've been, Jolie's reasonably new-ish CEO in Spark, and has been really open about what her board has set her around cultural expectations, and about the change that she wants to drive. And combined with her chair also being really public about those cultural changes that they're wanting to drive, we've seen a really positive response to that. I think there's greater transparency, and they're able to sort of measure some of those changes they're wanting to make. ASB is another great one. So Victoria, the CEO there, has been really open about some of the challenges that the banking industry has had off the back of the Culture and Conduct Survey that came out of Australia, the Hayne Royal Commission. And they've been really open, and their board has set a very clear action plan of the things that they're going to be working on. They've been transparent about that, and making culture number one. So I think there's great examples in that area. We've got some examples with Meridian and Z doing some great stuff in the climate change area as well. I think the board leadership we're seeing in New Zealand is pretty world class on some really important issues.
And there are some other big issues coming up. Little issues come along all the time. Obviously, the election is coming up, and people will be keeping an eye on not only where people want to vote and what their indication is there, but other things. The cannabis law reform. People are very worried about that, and the notion of how do you test, or what tests are valid, and is a test that picks up something that may have been in someone's system for 3 weeks kind of useless when what you want to know is an immediate impairment test. So all of these things need to be covered as well, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And I think, that's another great one from a health and safety perspective for directors, is that so often in management, we get caught up in the detail, in terms of how to test and what to do and all of those issues, where actually the conversation at a governance level, I think, is at the right place. And that's about impairment. And so, we've partnered with the Business Leaders Health and Safety Forum to make sure that there's some good information getting out to directors and to executive teams about what the impacts of the referendum might be if cannabis is legalised here, and the impacts around impairment. Because, while cannabis might be one of the areas that you need to factor in terms of your health and safety, there'll be alcohol, there'll be fatigue. I know as a young mum, when I had 2 kids and neither of them were sleeping, I was probably just as impaired as other people, but there's no sort of saliva test for that fatigue, and we actually sort of soldier on, don't we? And I think that's been one of the big things that that COVID perhaps has given us, is a change in what's okay around our health and safety in the workplace. And it's not okay to soldier on. You do have to put your hand up and say, I'm actually not feeling well. For everyone's safety, I'm going to stay home. We've seen a drop in colds and flus. And I think, we're going to have some difficult conversations in the workplace around marijuana and cannabis if it is legalised in the coming months. But good systems, good conversations, good engagement with our people, all of those things will get us through regardless of the impairment method. And they're really the ones we have to go back to. Good governance principles will see us through.
A very good point you bring up there around that kind of, when we start to talk about something like impairment, that broader notion of it, even that's changed. Mothers in particular, parents have always been impaired by fatigue, but now we're also seeing the rise of people just not sleeping because they're scrolling on their phones, or there's all these distractions. So, you've got all that kind of tiredness as well, just general tiredness coming through. So there's a lot of little things in there to unpack. How about the future of work? Are boards looking, you've given the indication that, people on boards need to be looking well ahead of where the curve is coming. What are the kind of discussions around the future of work, the workplaces? There must have been some big conversations over the last couple of months around even where do we go to do work?
Yeah, I think, we were having huge conversations sort of 2019 about the future of work. But work's changed on us already in 2020, hasn't it? In terms of actually where work gets done. There was so much conversation going on about the robots taking our jobs and AI and what was all of this going to mean, and what were going to be the industries that were going to survive and which ones weren't, and the rise of the importance of areas such as HR, where, if we're left with managing the people stuff, it's going to be the hard stuff, because the robots would have taken over the easy stuff for us. And so, one of the challenges that I think for the HR community is that the future of work conversation is being led in many ways, and I'm seeing it becoming an IT conversation, and it's being led by the CIO in the organisation because it's technology related. And actually it's not, and I really encourage all of the HRNZ members to actually take back that conversation about the future of work, because that is an HR conversation. That's ours. It's about people, it's about work, whether it's robots doing that work, whether it's people doing it, where we do work, how we do work, how things get achieved, what good performance looks like, how we lead people through change, how we adapt to all of that, how we invest in our systems and our people for this transition. That is an HR conversation. That's not an IT conversation, and we need to take it back.
What a great statement. It's interesting because we do talk about all this skills shortage in all these sectors, and actually, maybe, as you say, it's sort of an allocation of resources. If you've got skill shortages, what can you get people, things that people better doing, and allow the sort of technology to take over the rest of it? But you're right, the whole thing is, it's too often it is these bloody tech nerds in Silicon Valley driving all of these social changes. We've seen those social changes driven through the gig economy and things like that. If you're looking at the future of work, I don't think the gig economy is particularly sustainable in any
Well,
way, shape, or form.
we call it the gig economy now, but it wasn't that many years ago that we were calling it the casualisation of the workforce.
Yeah,
So I've got a personal view that if people are choosing to participate in the gig economy, then that's a really positive thing. But I think we need to be really careful with the future of work, and that if we're not creating social injustice situations where people it's becoming an extractive model and people are being driven into gig economy through no choice of their own. So I think that is a people conversation. That is for the HR community to be leading that. Back to sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If the computers are going to take care of the bottom layer, how do we help our communities and help our workforces get to the higher levels of self-actualization, the skills they're going to need to participate in this new work environment? And we're going to need better leaders to do that. So it's really important from an HR perspective, we're developing great leaders, because leading in that sort of new world is going to be a new skill set. We don't want to be sort of in the 80s model of just chasing costs to the bottom.
yeah. Look, a good place to begin to wrap up as well. It's pretty bloody. It sounds exciting. You can make a change. You can really make a difference when you rise to one of these positions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the great thing I love about governance is the influence it can have. It's one of the reasons I accepted this role at the Institute of Directors. I've shared with the HR community before, one of the reason that I took this role, there was this great quote from a speaker I heard from the UK who said, "Too long have we been in the hands of people who said leadership as a prize and not as a responsibility." That's something that's really resonated with me. One of the reasons I came here to the IOD. If we want to change and make sure we've got a great New Zealand Aotearoa, we want great businesses, great communities, then we need great governance to do that. So I really encourage everybody to make sure that they're leaning into these conversations, that they're seeing the opportunities to make the change where they can, and where there's lots of not-for-profits out there crying out for great directors and the skills that this community's got, and really happy to engage and connect with anybody who'd like to know more and see how we can help.
Look, and I'm sure people will come your way because you say, it's not just the kind of boards of Air New Zealand and Spark and whatnot. It's your community, it's your plunkets, it's your kindergartens, your sports groups. Literally anything you can think of in a community has, a need for people. How do people vote? A lot of these positions voted on, or people put their name into a.
Some still are, yeah, absolutely. A lot in the sports sector are still elected. And so, you have an affinity that way. My best advice for people who are interested in getting involved in governance is find something you're passionate about. Because when you start your governance career, inevitably it's in your discretionary time, right? It's after hours and the weekend because you're balancing, your family and you're balancing work, and it's an unpaid role on top of everything else. So if you're passionate about animals, find something in that sector. If you're passionate about kids, go and find something in that sector, because it'll all be at your own time. And some of those roles are elected, but you're probably connected to those clubs anyway because you're passionate about football.
Marvellous. Oh, there we go. Get amongst it, everybody. Be the change you want to see. You can have that responsibility, and make a difference. What's next for you? What's the most pressing thing that you're thinking about down there at the Institute of Directors?
Oh, yeah, the big thing for us is what's 21 going to look like? So
here's my question. Look,
yeah.
We don't know, and I might start asking people this as well because it's coming. 21 is coming. Just as we finish, do you think we need to be careful of the fact that people think once we finish in 2020, 2021 is going to come back and it's going to be this wonderful panacea and everything will be okay? Yeah. And when it's not okay, we're going to start to face some of the real ramifications of the last kind of 6 months or so.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and you've nailed it. I mean, the fact that I know that there's only, when we're filming this, there's only 13 Mondays to go. In this year is an indication. I can't think of a redeeming feature of this year other than the fact we've got a puppy, and I'm counting down until we get to 21. So,
small blessings.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's not all going to flip over on New Year's Eve and everything's going to be okay next year. We are seeing recession environment, the impact of subsidy coming off. We are seeing, I'm hearing even anecdotally, I spoke to a recruiter last week for, she said before COVID, she advertised for a reception role and she had 60 applications. She advertised for one last week and she had 600. So, you know, we've got a lot of people, particularly women, who we know that there's large numbers of women displaced as part of the COVID redundancies. As we head into 2021, families are going to be under pressure. So, you know, that's, you know, challenging us here at the Institute of Directors. We run events and events haven't been running. All of those sorts of pressures about how we help directors to guide their organisations through what could still be a pretty tough year ahead.
Marvellous. What we need, obviously, good leaders, good leadership, and good leaders coming through, and people being pushed up as well. I imagine, you know, there's a lot of people who probably don't put themselves forward who could be quite good at this. So, you know, if you know people who might be a good leader, by all means, give them a little list, give them a little stick, a little
scoot over and pull one up. Absolutely, pull one up beside you.
That's exactly right, Kirsten Patterson, Institute of Directors Chief Executive. What a pleasure to chat today on HR Chats. All right, thank you. That was HR Chats with me, Te Reira. As we said, if there is anyone you think we should speak to, any topic that you feel you would have a pressing interest in listening to, by all means, let us know via the HRNZ website. And that's all for now for this episode. Take care. We'll see you again.